The evening was calm and quiet, the sky painted in soft colors as the sun began to fade, and into a small-town diner walked a man who did not look like anyone important. His clothes were plain, his shoes looked worn out, and his face carried the look of someone who had traveled a long way. Nobody in the diner turned their heads at first, but when the door closed behind him and the sound of his footsteps echoed, people began to notice him. They noticed not with kindness but with suspicion, their eyes scanning him from head to toe, whispering to one another that he did not look like the kind of customer who belonged there. He moved slowly toward a table near the window, his eyes calm and steady, and he placed himself in a seat without saying a word, his hands resting quietly on the table. He looked like any ordinary man, but deep inside him lay a story that nobody in that diner could ever imagine. For this man was not just another traveler, he was a billionaire, one of the richest men in the country, a man whose name had been printed in magazines, a man whose wealth could buy the diner 1,000 times over. Yet tonight he sat in silence, covered in clothes that made him invisible to the world around him. The waitress on duty noticed him right away. She frowned as she walked closer, wiping her hands on her apron, her steps heavy with impatience. She looked at him with a cold expression, her eyes narrowing, and in a sharp tone she said, "You cannot sit here, we do not serve people like you." Her voice was loud enough that a few customers turned their heads again. Some chuckled. Others whispered with mocking smiles. The man did not answer. He simply looked back at the waitress with a calm expression, as if her words could not reach him. The waitress crossed her arms and tapped her foot. She was growing angry that he did not respond. She leaned forward and repeated, "I said we do not serve people like you. Please leave before I call the manager." Her voice sharper now, cutting through the low noise of the diner. More eyes turned toward the man, curiosity mixing with cruelty. Some customers smirked, some shook their heads as if agreeing with the waitress, and the atmosphere grew thick with judgment. Still the man did not move. He reached for the menu on the table and opened it slowly, his movements calm, deliberate, his face unreadable, as if he were deaf to the words thrown at him. And this silence made the room even more tense, for nobody could understand why he stayed seated when he had clearly been told to leave. The customers leaned forward in their chairs. The whispers grew louder, and the waitress's face turned red with frustration. A man at a nearby table leaned toward his friend and muttered loudly enough for others to hear, "Look at him. He probably cannot even afford a cup of coffee. His shoes are falling apart. What is he doing here?" The friend laughed and nodded, adding, "Maybe he is homeless. Maybe he walked in by mistake." Both of them laughed again, their voices mixing with the waitress's harsh tone, as she demanded once more that the man leave at once. The man's silence was not weakness. It was strength, but nobody could see it, not yet. To them he looked like someone out of place, someone unworthy of respect, and their words grew sharper, their laughter grew louder. The waitress pointed toward the door with impatience, telling him to get out before she really called the manager, her voice ringing through the diner like a final warning. And yet he stayed seated, his eyes on the menu, his hands steady, as if nothing could disturb him. The suspense began to build in the room, because people were confused. Why was this man not leaving? Why did he not argue? Why did he not fight back? Why was he sitting there so calm while everyone around him mocked him? The air grew heavier, curiosity mixing with judgment, and all eyes remained locked on the quiet man who had walked in like a shadow, but now held the attention of the entire diner. The waitress slammed her order pad on the counter. Muttering under her breath, some customers shook their heads in disapproval. Others leaned closer to watch what would happen next. Everyone expected the man to either stand up in shame or explode in anger, yet neither happened. Instead, his stillness grew more powerful, his silence louder than the words thrown at him. And though the room was filled with noise, the quiet man sitting at the table seemed to control it all. It was at this moment that a sense of mystery wrapped around the diner, for deep inside everyone knew there was something unusual about him, something different, but nobody could put it into words. And so they waited, restless, impatient, their eyes fixed on the man who refused to move. The man who seemed so ordinary yet carried an energy that made the whole diner uneasy, and little did they know that soon he would speak. And with only 4 simple words, he would change everything they thought they knew. The waitress stood with her arms crossed, her eyes sharp and full of judgment. Her patience already gone, she spoke again, her voice louder this time, saying clearly that he should leave before she brought the manager. Her words echoed across the small diner, breaking through the low chatter of forks and spoons, making even those who had ignored the man now turn their heads toward him. The man sat still, His back straight, his hands resting gently on the table. He gave no answer, no reaction, no movement. His silence was not weak, it was steady, calm, powerful in a way that made people uncomfortable. The waitress leaned closer, pointing toward the door, and said again that he must leave, her face showing frustration as if she could not believe he dared to ignore her. A young couple sitting nearby whispered to each other. One of them said he looks like a beggar. Maybe he is just here to stay warm. The other nodded and said he should not sit here. He is making everyone uncomfortable. The words floated across the room, carried by cruel laughter, and the sound of it hit the man like sharp stones, yet he did not flinch. He kept his eyes steady on the menu in front of him, as if the insults were nothing more than wind passing by. The tension in the room grew heavier. Customers leaned in their chairs, some smiling, some frowning, waiting to see what would happen next. The waitress tapped her fingers on the table and said in a sharp voice, "You are not welcome here. We do not want your kind in this place," and her words cut like a blade through the air. But the man simply looked at her with calm eyes, his face showing no anger, no fear, only quiet patience. A man in a business suit sitting at the counter chuckled and said loudly, "Maybe he cannot even read the menu. Maybe he is just pretending." His laugh spread to a few others who joined in, shaking their heads with mocking smiles. The waitress smirked as if their laughter gave her power. She placed her hands on her hips and demanded again that the man get out of her diner, her voice sharp and commanding. The man finally placed the menu down, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked at the waitress for a long moment, his gaze strong yet calm. Then without a word he leaned back in his chair, his silence pressing against the noise around him. The waitress frowned deeper, anger flashing in her eyes, because she could not understand why he refused to obey, why he chose to sit there when everyone wanted him gone. Whispers spread faster now. People began guessing who he might be. Some said he was a traveler with no money. Others said he might be a thief looking for trouble. One woman even whispered that he might be dangerous, and the fear mixed with curiosity, filling the diner with restless energy. All eyes stayed on him, waiting, watching, wondering what he would do next. The waitress raised her voice once more, threatening to call the police if he did not leave. Her words sharp and full of authority, but still he remained in his chair, his eyes calm, his hands steady. His silence louder than her threats, and the room grew even more tense. Some customers shifted uncomfortably. Others whispered cruel jokes, but nobody could look away, for there was something about this man that held them captive, something they could not name. The man in the business suit laughed again and said, "He thinks he is somebody important, but look at him, he is nothing." His voice carried mockery, his laughter joined by others who enjoyed the scene. But there were also some who felt uneasy, who wondered why the man looked so calm, why he did not fight or leave, why he carried himself with a quiet strength even as he was insulted and pushed away. The waitress finally slammed her hand on the table, her voice trembling with frustration. She said that she was done with him, that he needed to leave immediately, that she would not serve him a single thing. And for the first time the man's lips curved slightly, not a smile but something close, a quiet response without words, and that small expression only deepened the mystery around him, making everyone lean closer in suspense. The silence stretched on, long and heavy, the waitress breathing hard, the customers waiting, the man sitting like a stone in the middle of the storm, his calm presence more powerful than the insults and threats around him. And though nobody could explain it, they all felt it, a strange energy that made the room feel smaller, tighter, as if something important was about to happen, something that would turn the entire moment upside down. The waitress shook her head, muttering that she did not have time for this. She turned toward the counter, ready to fetch the manager. The customers murmured with excitement, some eager to see the man thrown out, others curious to see if he would resist. But deep inside, though they laughed and mocked, there was a spark of doubt, a quiet whisper that maybe they were wrong, maybe this man was not who they thought he was. Maybe there was something about him they could not yet see. And as the waitress moved away, the man lifted his eyes, his calm gaze sweeping the room, and for the first time a quiet tension spread through the diner, a silent message that something unexpected was coming, something that would soon leave them all speechless, though they did not yet know it. The moment was drawing closer, and with every passing second the suspense grew stronger, gripping every heart in the room. The diner grew restless as the waitress walked quickly toward the counter, her voice sharp as she muttered about calling the manager, her steps heavy with anger, and all around the room people leaned closer in their seats, waiting, watching, whispering among themselves. The man sat quietly at the table, his hands folded, his eyes calm, as if he was unaware of the storm building around him. A man sitting near the door shook his head and said loudly, "He should not be here. He does not belong in this place." His words carried through the diner and others nodded. One woman near the back spoke up with a mocking tone. "Look at him. His clothes are worn. He looks like he has nothing. Why would he come into a place like this?" Her voice full of disdain, the sound feeding into the tension that was already burning like fire. The waitress turned back and said to the crowd, "See, I told him to leave, but he refuses. He is wasting our time. He has no money. I can see it on him." She crossed her arms and smirked, certain that she was right. The man in the business suit clapped his hands once and laughed, saying, "This is entertaining. Let us see how long he lasts." His words sent more chuckles through the diner, cruel and mocking, while the man at the table remained as silent as stone. A teenager near the counter whispered to his friend, "Maybe he is crazy. Maybe he is just sitting there because he lost his mind." The friend laughed and said, "Or maybe he wants free food." Both of them laughed harder, their voices carrying across the small space, adding to the storm of insults and judgments. The man heard every word, but his face stayed calm, his eyes unshaken, his silence unbroken, and this only made the crowd more curious. The waitress finally raised her voice again, saying, "This is your last chance. Leave now before I drag the manager out here." Her face red with frustration, her hands shaking with anger. The customers clapped softly. Some whistled as if they wanted a show, as if the quiet man was no longer a person but a spectacle for their entertainment. Yet through it all he sat still, his presence strong, his silence louder than their voices. One man with a thick beard leaned forward and shouted, "Go on, get out. You are wasting everyone's time. We all know you cannot pay." His voice deep and booming, making others laugh and nod. A woman beside him added, "I bet he has not eaten in days. That is why he came here. Maybe he hoped someone would buy him a meal." She shook her head and looked away with disgust, but her words burned into the air, carried by the cruel smiles around the room. The man looked slowly around the diner, his eyes meeting theirs one by one. He did not speak, but his calm stare was enough to quiet a few of them for a moment, enough to make their laughter falter, but the silence did not last. The business suit man raised his glass and said loudly, "Here is to the stranger who thinks he is better than us," his mocking toast sending another wave of laughter through the diner. Though not everyone laughed now. Some sat with uneasy expressions. Some shifted in their seats, sensing something they could not explain. The waitress grew tired of waiting and shouted, "Fine, if you do not leave. Then I will call the police," her voice sharp, slicing through the noise, but again the man did not move, his stillness making the room colder, his silence spreading like a shadow. And suddenly the diner seemed smaller, tighter, as if everyone was trapped in a moment that was leading to something they could not predict. The customers kept throwing words like stones, each insult sharper than the last, but hidden in their laughter was a nervous edge, because deep inside, though they mocked, they wondered, who was this man? Why did he sit there so calm? Why did he not fight? Why did he not leave? What kind of strength allowed him to remain when the whole room was against him? And that question unsettled them more than his silence. The waitress stepped forward again, pointing directly at him, her finger trembling, her voice rising higher as she demanded one last time that he leave. Her words echoed across the diner. Every head turned, every breath held, waiting, watching, and at that moment, though nobody could explain it, the room fell into a strange hush. The laughter faded, the whispers died down, all eyes locked on the man as he lifted his head slowly and looked straight at the waitress. For a moment time seemed to stop, the air heavy, the silence deep, the crowd waiting for his first words, expecting anger, expecting begging, expecting anything but what was truly coming. The man's lips parted slightly as if he was ready to speak, but he held it back, and the suspense grew even stronger, the tension so thick that every heartbeat in the room felt louder than the words that had been thrown at him. The customers leaned forward, the waitress froze in place, the man's calm eyes sweeping across the room once more, and though he had still not spoken, though he had not moved, everyone felt that something powerful was about to happen. Something that would turn their laughter into silence, something that would shake the room in a way they had never felt before. The moment was near, the quiet before the storm, the edge of a truth that none of them could see coming. The diner was silent now. The laughter faded, the whispers gone. All eyes locked on the quiet man who had sat through every insult, every harsh word, without moving, without speaking. The waitress stood with her hand on her hip, her eyes full of fire, her body tense as she waited for him to finally break, to finally give in, but instead something else happened. Something that no one in that room could have expected. The man slowly leaned forward, his hands resting gently on the table, his gaze steady, his presence calm yet heavy. He looked at the waitress as if he could see right through her, as if he knew something she did not. The crowd leaned in closer, the air thick with curiosity, the silence pressing against their ears. And then at last the man spoke, his voice low but clear, his words simple yet sharp enough to cut through the entire diner. Check your bank account. Those 4 words hung in the air like thunder, echoing in the silence. Every customer froze, their eyes wide, their mouths open. The waitress blinked in confusion, her anger replaced by shock. She stammered, "What did you say?" Her voice trembling for the first time. The man repeated slowly, "Check your bank account." Each word calm, each word heavy, each word carrying a weight that nobody could understand yet. The waitress laughed nervously, trying to cover her unease. She pulled out her phone and tapped the screen, her hands shaking slightly though she tried to hide it. The customers watched with eager eyes, whispering to one another, "What is he talking about? What is he doing? Is this some kind of joke?" The waitress frowned, her eyes narrowing as she opened her banking app, her breath quickening as she scrolled, and then suddenly her face changed. Her eyes widened, her lips parted, her hand covered her mouth. She gasped loudly and her knees almost buckled. The phone trembled in her hand as she whispered, "This cannot be real, this cannot be true." She looked again, refreshing the screen, but the numbers remained. Her account showed a deposit so large she could not believe it, money beyond anything she had ever seen in her life. Money that could wipe away her debts, money that could change her future forever. The crowd erupted in confusion, people shouting, "What happened? What is going on? What does she see?" The waitress turned toward the man, her face pale, her voice breaking. "Did you do this?" Her words barely more than a whisper. The man sat calmly, his eyes steady, his silence stronger than ever. He gave no explanation, no details, only the weight of those 4 words that still echoed in her ears. "Check your bank account." The customers stood now, crowding closer to see her phone. Some gasped, some covered their mouths in shock. Others muttered that it had to be a trick, but the waitress shook her head wildly, tears forming in her eyes. She whispered again, "It is real, it is real," her body trembling as she clutched the phone to her chest. The diner buzzed with chaos, voices rising, questions flying. Yet through it all the man sat still, the calm in the middle of the storm. The business suit man who had mocked the loudest stepped forward and demanded, "What is happening? What did he do?" He looked between the waitress and the man, his face pale now, his earlier laughter gone, his voice filled with unease. The waitress turned to him with tears streaming down her cheeks and said, "He put money in my account, a fortune, more than I could ever dream." Her words shook the entire room. The crowd gasped. Some stepped back in disbelief. Others leaned closer, their curiosity burning hotter than ever. The teenager who had laughed earlier whispered to his friend, "Who is he? How can he do that?" The whispers grew louder, turning into a storm of voices, everyone demanding answers, everyone desperate to know the truth. But the man gave none. He sat quietly, his eyes calm, his silence stronger than their noise, and his 4 words kept echoing in their minds. "Check your bank account." Words that would never be forgotten. The waitress dropped to her knees, overwhelmed with emotion. She looked up at him with tears in her eyes, shame covering her face, regret heavy in her voice as she whispered, "I am sorry, I am so sorry." Her hands trembling as she tried to wipe her tears. The customers fell silent again, their laughter gone, their judgment vanished, replaced by awe and fear, for they realized now that the man they had mocked was no ordinary man. The air in the diner shifted. Heavy with the weight of truth, the crowd stared at him, their minds racing, their hearts pounding. The waitress sobbing on the floor, the phone still glowing in her hand with the proof of his power. And in that moment, everyone understood that appearances can deceive, that silence can hold strength, and that sometimes 4 simple words can shatter everything you thought you knew. The man finally stood, his chair sliding back with a quiet scrape, his figure tall and strong though his clothes were simple. He looked at the room one last time, his eyes sweeping across their shocked faces. And then without another word he turned toward the door, his steps slow and steady, his presence leaving the diner as heavy as it had entered. The crowd watching in silence, their hearts trembling, their minds unable to forget the 4 words that had just changed everything. The diner was frozen in silence, the waitress still on her knees, her phone glowing in her trembling hands, tears rolling down her cheeks as she stared at the numbers on the screen. The customers stood in disbelief, their eyes wide, their mouths open, nobody able to find the right words. The man who had been mocked and insulted only minutes before now stood in the center of the storm, calm and quiet, his presence larger than life. The waitress lifted her tearful eyes toward him, her voice breaking as she whispered again, "How is this possible? Who are you?" The man looked down at her, his gaze soft but steady. He reached into the pocket of his worn jacket and pulled out a small leather wallet. It looked old and simple, but inside it lay a card that caught the attention of everyone nearby. The card bore his name, a name that many had seen in magazines, on news articles, a name tied to enormous companies and endless wealth. The waitress gasped loudly, her tears flowing harder as she realized who he was. She whispered his name as if it burned her lips, her voice trembling as she said, "You are him. You are the billionaire." Her words shook the room like thunder. The crowd erupted into chaos, gasps filling the air, people pointing, whispering frantically. The man they had mocked, the man they had judged, was in fact one of the richest men in the world. Yet he had walked in dressed like a simple traveler. The man in the business suit stumbled back, his face pale, his confidence shattered, his mocking smile gone. He muttered to himself in disbelief. I laughed at him, I insulted him, his voice weak and broken. Others shook their heads in shame, their earlier words now cutting through their own hearts like knives. The teenager near the counter whispered softly to his friend, "We treated him like dirt, and now look." The friend could not even answer, his mouth dry, his eyes wide with shock. The billionaire slipped the card back into his wallet, his movements calm. He looked at the room filled with shame and regret, his voice deep and steady. As he finally spoke more than 4 words, he said, "I came here dressed in simple clothes because I wanted to see how people treat others when they believe someone has nothing." His words rolled through the diner like a wave, heavy and unshakable, making everyone lower their heads in guilt. Because they knew what they had done, they had judged him by his appearance and nothing more. The waitress sobbed louder now, her voice breaking as she begged for forgiveness, saying again and again, "I am sorry, I did not know. I should never have treated you like that." The customers echoed her regret, muttering apologies, their faces red with shame. But the billionaire did not look angry. He did not shout. He simply stood tall and calm, his voice soft but strong as he said, "It is not me you should apologize to, it is yourselves, because your hearts chose cruelty over kindness. And that is a lesson you must carry." The air in the diner grew heavier, thick with regret. The waitress lowered her head to the ground, her tears dripping onto the floor, her voice weak as she whispered, "I thought you were poor. I thought you were nothing." The billionaire shook his head slowly, his voice steady as he replied, "And that is the problem. You thought I was less because of how I looked. But the truth is, every person who walks into this place deserves respect, no matter how they dress, no matter what they have." The customers listened in silence, their eyes full of guilt, their hearts heavy with the weight of his words. The teenager who had laughed earlier whispered softly, "He is right, we were wrong." His friend nodded weakly, unable to lift his head. The man in the business suit covered his face with his hand, ashamed of the cruel words he had thrown. The entire diner was filled with the sound of quiet breaths, of heavy silence, of hearts learning a painful truth. The waitress finally rose to her feet, her legs shaking, her voice trembling as she said, "You gave me money, more money than I have ever seen. But I do not deserve it, not after the way I treated you." Her eyes pleaded with him, her tears unstoppable. The billionaire looked at her for a long moment, his gaze soft but piercing, and he said calmly, "I did not give it because you deserve it. I gave it because I wanted to remind you that kindness should never depend on appearances." The room fell silent again, his words sinking deep into every heart. The waitress collapsed back into her chair. Sobbing quietly, the customers lowered their eyes, some wiping away tears, none of them able to forget the lesson he had just spoken. The billionaire turned toward the door once more, his step slow, his presence commanding, every movement echoing with meaning. The entire diner watching him, their lives changed forever in that single moment. The truth was now clear. The man they had denied, the man they had mocked, was in fact a billionaire. Yet he had not come to show his wealth. He had come to reveal their hearts, and now that truth burned within them. A truth they could never erase, a truth that would echo in their minds for years to come. The diner was still in shock, the air thick with silence, every customer frozen in place, their minds spinning with what they had just learned. The waitress sat slumped in her chair with tears falling down her face, her hands clutching the phone that still showed the unbelievable numbers, her body trembling with regret and shame. She whispered again and again that she was sorry, her voice weak, her words broken. But the man did not scold her. He did not demand anything. He simply stood there, tall and calm, his eyes steady and kind. He looked around the room, his gaze touching every person, his presence strong, his voice deep as he finally spoke again. He said softly yet firmly, "Never judge people by what you see. Never decide a person's worth by their clothes or by what you think they have." His words echoed in the silence, heavy and sharp, cutting straight into the hearts of those who had mocked him only moments ago. The teenager lowered his head, ashamed of the cruel jokes he had made. The man in the business suit rubbed his forehead, unable to meet the billionaire's eyes. The woman who had laughed before now wiped away quiet tears as guilt filled her chest. The billionaire's words did not sound like anger. They sounded like truth. Truth that could not be ignored, he said again. Kindness should not depend on appearance, it should live in your heart. Because one day the person you mock may be the one who saves you. One day the person you look down on may be the one who lifts you up. The customers shifted in their seats, their breath shaky, their hearts heavy. They knew he was right. They knew they had failed the test. The waitress cried harder, her tears falling onto the floor, her voice trembling as she said, "You gave me more than I could ever dream. But the real gift is the lesson. I will never forget it." The billionaire looked at her quietly, then turned his eyes back to the crowd. His expression calm but full of meaning, he said, "Remember this moment. Remember how quickly you chose cruelty over kindness, and do not repeat it again, because every person you meet deserves respect." The crowd was silent, their faces red with shame, their voices lost. The man in the business suit finally whispered, "I am sorry," his voice small and broken. The teenager added softly, "I will not laugh at people again." The woman who had insulted him before said through tears, "I feel so ashamed." And all around the diner, the sound of quiet apologies filled the air. Yet the billionaire only nodded, his eyes calm, his voice steady as he said, "The apology is not for me, it is for yourselves. So that you can grow and change." He stepped toward the door, his shoes making soft sounds against the floor. Every eye followed him, every heart beating faster. Nobody wanted him to leave. Yet they knew they could not stop him. The waitress stood quickly, her voice desperate as she called out, "Wait, please do not go," her tears still running. But the billionaire paused only for a moment, his back straight, his voice deep as he said, "I came to test hearts, and tonight I learned the truth. Now it is up to you to change it." With those final words, he pushed open the door, the cold night air rushing in, the sound of the bell above the frame echoing across the diner. He stepped outside, his figure slowly fading into the darkness, his presence leaving the room but his words remaining. Heavy and unforgettable, the customers sat in silence. The waitress dropped back into her chair, her hands covering her face as she cried. The diner no longer felt the same. The food tasted different. The air carried weight. Every person inside had been changed. They had seen with their own eyes the power of 4 simple words. Check your bank account. Words that revealed not only wealth but also wisdom. Words that uncovered the weakness of human judgment and the strength of humility and kindness. The lesson would follow them home. It would follow them for years, whispering in their ears whenever they looked at a stranger, reminding them of the night they mocked a billionaire and learned the truth. The waitress eventually stood again, wiping her tears, her voice trembling but stronger than before. She said quietly to herself and to the room, "From now on I will treat every person with kindness, no matter how they look, no matter what they have." Her words carried softly but firmly through the diner, and though nobody answered, every person silently agreed, their hearts heavy with regret, but also touched with hope, because they now knew they could change outside. The billionaire walked slowly down the street, his figure blending into the night, his heart calm, his lips carrying the faintest trace of a smile, for he had once again proven that true wealth was not measured in money, but in the lessons that could awaken souls. And though the diner behind him was filled with tears and regret, it was also filled with seeds of change, seeds that would grow into kindness, respect, and understanding. And that was the greatest gift he could leave behind.